Welcome to Breaking the Silence of Design, a bi-monthly vodcast designed to discuss the issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the built environment. My name is Karen Compton, and I am your co-host and founder of A3K Consulting.
And I'm Gabrielle Bullock, your other co-host and principal and director of global diversity for Perkins and Will. And today we are joined by my dear friend, founding principal of Fabric in Pasadena, and member of the faculty at Cal Poly Pomona's Center for Environmental Design, Nina Briggs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nina is a graduate of the School of Architecture at USC. She has taught architecture, interior architecture, and landscape architecture for a variety of universities, including Cal State Northridge, Woodbury University, and the Art Institute of Los Angeles. She is the definition of a scholar and an educator, and we welcome perspective in this discussion. Welcome.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I'm going to dive right in. You created a course at Cal Poly Pomona called Justicescape. And first of all, I want to know, why did you create it? And second of all, why did you feel it was necessary? What is it? What is the course and how is it necessary?
Well, I wasn't planning on creating a course, but our students wrote an open letter in May after George Floyd was murdered. And they wrote an open letter to the faculty with a list of demands. Some of those demands included more representative faculty, and a rehauling of the curriculum, basically, to include the erased histories and resources for the built environment. And simultaneously, I had been reading everything I could get my hands on about critical race theory and anti-racist ideals as related to the built environment. And there have been these reading lists floating around among academics and professionals and everybody. I read as many reading lists as I could.
And we'll talk about that too, because you have a lot of reading lists.
Yes, and I realized that reading the books, reading the reading lists was not going to be enough if all of those things are not contextualized, if the dots are not connecting. And especially as an educator, in order to relate racism and its consequences to what I teach, there's a lot of dots that need to be connected. So again, not intending to create a course, and because I am a visual learner, I created a map or a data visualization of all the topics and subtopics about racism and policy and law and how they relate to the built environment, and started connecting the dots so that I could understand how much racism and white supremacy are embedded in all our systems. And I showed it to a colleague, and she said, "This is a class."
So you originally did this for your own personal edification and understanding.
Yeah, I am not a race scholar. I'm, an architect, a practitioner, an educator, and I think we're all undereducated on the history of this country. And so I was really trying to educate myself. I was fascinated by what I was learning, and I needed for it to make sense to me. And then it was suggested that my process be made into a course. And at the same time, it satisfied one of the student leadership group's demands.
So what's the course? Tell me about the course. Tell us about the course.
And how it's been perceived so far.
Well, The course is open to all students in the College of Environmental Design. So that's architecture, landscape architecture, art, and urban design. And I have students from all of those disciplines who signed up for the course. It is literally connecting the dots from policy to the built environment and everything in between. I believe that we are to teach students how to design our futures, but they can't do that if they don't understand our past and how the built environment is actually made. And so I think that's a really key piece that's missing from design education. We teach students how to design. We give them theoretical and sometimes real life projects, but we don't talk very much about the process towards getting something built. And so that's really what the course is about. But I thought it would be important to set up kind of a rules of engagement. So I wrote a manifesto so that we could have difficult conversations, but engage each other with respect and empathy and patience. This is a fraught time. We are teaching on Zoom. The students are scattered all across the country. Some of them are even outside of the country. They are anxious, sometimes depressed, fearful about their futures, as we all are. This is a fraught time. And so I wanted to create a safe space for, not only for the students to talk about their concerns about this racial reckoning and, you know, among the pandemic and in an election year and the loss of normality, but to help them connect the dots.
How's it been perceived? I think that was one of, how's the class been received?
First of all, how long have you been teaching it?
This is week 6.
Oh, okay, so you, enough to get a perception, I imagine.
I think it's mostly positive, at least from the students. I invite my colleagues, the other faculty members, to attend as well. I created a website for the course because there's so much information. The website is becoming almost like a living database because I felt the need to cull all of these resources that I spoke about earlier, the books and the reading lists, and organize them in categories that can be easily accessed. So I believe the response is positive, just by the number of students that have enrolled in the class, and my faculty is supportive. So we'll see.
Well, good for you.
Stay tuned.
Okay, next question. So we've talked and texted, emailed and IM'd about a variety of perspectives presented by authors such as Isabel Wilkerson's Cast that explores the misconceptions of racism, and Angela Davis's Freedom. Freedom is a Constant Struggle, that I believe you read, on intersectionality. How do justice and anti-racism intersect with architecture and landscape architecture? More importantly, how do we begin to address that in the way in which we teach?
Okay, so that's an easy question.
I said it was the next question. I didn't say it was easy.
Well, first of all, intersectionality, I think the phrase was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think that she developed intersectionality as part of radical feminism to include women of color in feminism. And I think that she derived some of those concepts from Angela Davis. And so I'm a little sensitive to the term intersectionality and making sure that Kimberly Crenshaw gets credit for developing the theory. And also people are using the word intersectionality, sometimes not understanding its origins and applying it.
More broadly.
Yeah, more broadly. So I wouldn't use intersectionality too much with the Justicescape course. But when we look at how the built environment has been made, how we build our infrastructure and our cities and our homes, the point is to understand the various factors that go into that. So for example, one of the assignments, the students had to kind of create almost a mathematical equation, citing historical legislation and today's laws or policies that are essentially kind of an upgraded 2.0 version of what has always been in place. And to trace the history of those evolving legislations. And when you look at it that way, you understand exactly why our cities look the way they do. So the intersectionality of that is that, for example, Jim Crow laws and segregation are inextricably linked with voter suppression and home ownership, social mobility, and some upgraded versions of that would be redlining. And that is linked to the real estate industry and our banking systems and environmental injustices. And then you go a little further towards today, and we have gerrymandering and gentrification and voter suppression again. And so for me, it's less about intersectionality, but finding the thread that links all of these intersecting topics together so that we understand what has not changed.
Right. Sort of like connecting those dots for your students in your class.
Exactly.
And you said it's almost like a mathematical equation because you start with the beginning of policy 100, 200 years ago and then look at it going forward. With each kind of iteration, it's cleaned up a little bit, for lack of a better word, for whatever is palatable in that time.
Right.
And then we respond, if I understand you correctly, through design to whatever that policy is at that particular point, and then we evolve to the next level and keep doing that, as opposed to really stopping and deconstructing and saying, wait a minute, why are we doing what we're doing? And is this right, and is it just?
And recognizing the same injustice in an updated version and calling it out.
I think that's incredibly important. I think sometimes, and we've had this conversation, we don't always necessarily call it out. We might recognize it, but it's not necessarily collectively called out. And I know that's one of the things that we've been trying to raise the conversation around.
Well, yeah, so when you look at the voter suppression that has happened in the southern states in the last few months, it may not be the same exact methodology that happened after Jim Crow, when Black people were asked to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to qualify to vote, but the intention is the same.
So it would appear that we're on a journey to kind of deconstruct anti-racist behavior. And not sure that we're all going to reach the destination, but we're all going to certainly enjoy the journey. I recently heard one of my colleagues, and we've actually had this discussion offline. I actually heard one of my colleagues say, some people aren't necessarily going to want to go on the journey, but we can shame them into going. And I stopped and thought about that, and I thought, that's probably not the best approach. I'm curious as to what are your thoughts about getting people to go along on this journey to deconstruct and construct how we teach, how we bring people along, how we foster people in this process.
Well, shame is not an effective social justice tool, period, in my opinion. And that's one of the tenets of my manifesto. Because shame makes people feel like they don't belong, that they don't deserve to be part of the conversation. I think it's ineffective. By the same token, I am not trying to make anyone see anything. That is not my job. People have to come to these understandings on their own. I was exceptionally curious about all of this, and so I investigated. And the people who are curious about it are investigating with me. I don't believe you can change hearts and minds, and that's not my purpose. I can only change myself. But that's what I love about teaching, because it is possible to create, I hope, a safe space in which we can all explore these concepts together, arrive at our own conclusions, respect one another for our differences in opinions or perspectives, but go on into the profession doing what we can.
How do you want, I'm curious for both of you, how do you want the profession to come along and support you? I mean, we're all sitting here kind of representing different facets. You're on the academic side, you're on the larger corporate side. I'm curious as to how you would envision.
Well, you know, I think that what you're curious about and how you're teaching your students around this topic, and how I'm trying to foster a more diverse and inclusive and just profession, it's because it's all about humanity, right? This is, I think I said it on the very first episode of this is not rocket science. It's about humanity. So if we're designing the built environment, designing for communities, why wouldn't we want to be curious and understand how communities have been impacted by our design approach, by our educational approach? So I too, I mean, I am trying to bring folks along, but I can't make them come along.
Yeah. I think we're all trying to make people, not make people, but we want to bring them along. If they want to go on the journey, we want them to come along. Final thoughts, Miss Nina?
I think it's also important, at least to me, to question nomenclature. So the language that we use to describe each other, the labels that are put on us, I think need investigating. So diversity, inclusion, equity, I ask my students, what does that really mean? A person, him or herself, cannot be diverse. I am not diverse, I am, just who I am. But also being called a minority. If we look at the world population, people of color are 89% of the world population. So, minority, BIPOC. Yeah, what does that really mean, and who came up with that label for people who are Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color? So it's really just about questioning everything. What does that mean to you? that's my way of bringing people along, as you say.
I do think it's interesting that you bring up the word minority, because I think the choice of that word is used oftentimes to minimize someone or their contribution or who they are, not because they are less represented, which is how the term often gets utilized.
Or that it's become the go-to word by certain people. I do not use that term.
Yeah.
I do not like that term. I don't think it's representative of anybody. And so I try not to use it, but it's become the go-to word. So every time I hear it in any of these conversations, I raise that issue, right? So I agree with you that we should think about the words we use, because words matter.
Language is very powerful, as Toni Morrison used to say, mainly because we internalize those words, all of us, and how we see ourselves is more important to me than how other people see us. I want my students to arise in a new kind of dignity, knowing who they are after questioning terminology. One of the assignments that they had to do was they had to go to their parents or their grandparents and ask about their family histories and legacies. And then they had to study what dignity means. And after having those conversations and asking questions, they discovered things that they either had forgotten or hadn't been discussed before. And then I asked them to take a Renaissance or 19th century classic bourgeoisie painting and Photoshop themselves into it, so that they can reclaim their family's legacy of dignity, that they can find the pride and the dignity in those humble backgrounds, rediscover the honor of their families, and realize that caste does not define who you are. And in fact, the definition of caste, as it was constructed in this country, was meant, as you say, to debase people. And so it's really about looking at every single word, policy, law, and deconstructing it and stripping it of its power.
I appreciate you for coming. We appreciate you for coming. We appreciate you for giving us some language in which we can talk, not just academically, but within our firms. So I want to thank you for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And I want to thank IBI Group, who is our sponsor for this program and for this journey. And I thank all of you. I really do.
And I want to thank you too, Nina, and I want to thank our followers, our subscribers, and you can continue the dialogue on Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And join us next time as we continue the uncomfortable conversations with our next guest. Thank you.